If you're like us, you've probably seen references to something called Munchausen's by proxy and been curious, without really understanding what it is or how it may affect people. That's why we were excited to hear about the new podcast, Nobody Should Believe Me.
The host, novelist Andrea Dunlop, takes an in-depth look at this subject. No one has ever done this before. She talks with people who have been affected by this condition. She even speaks with a perpetrator.
We've already listened to the first 2 episodes, and we can tell you that Andrea doesn't dwell on the darkness. She takes great pains not to be gory or exploitative. This show has heart. It focuses on the humanity of everyone involved.
And what makes this podcast extra special is that Andrea has a deeply personal connection to this subject. Someone very close to her was investigated for Munchausen by proxy. That gives the show a real emotional punch. When Andrea is listening to people tell stories about how they've been affected by this condition, she is not some uninvolved outsider. She has lived through the very same pain they have. She understands them. And through this podcast, she helps all of us understand them too.
New episodes drop every Thursday. Listen and subscribe to Nobody Should Believe Me on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. Content warning. This episode contains discussion of murder, specifically the murder of a child.
Here at the Murder Sheet, we are huge fans of the author Scott Turow. His first novel, Presumed Innocent, came out back in 1987 and introduced readers to the lawyers of Kendall County. In the years since, Turow has published many more novels, rich and gripping legal thrillers, each one well worth reading. But his literary work is only a portion of Turow's professional life. He's also worked pro bono in several death penalty cases, was a lead counsel in a federal probe of judicial corruption in Illinois, and also worked cases involving police misconduct.
Just last month, he published his newest novel, Suspect. It is a terrific book. Narrated by a reckless and relentless young investigator named Pinky, it tells the story of a female police chief who is accused of requiring her subordinates to give her sex in exchange for promotions. And that is just the beginning. We both really enjoyed all the twists and turns in the novel and strongly recommend it. Recently, we got the chance to talk with Scott Turow about Suspect and his own fascinating legal career. He will even tell us about an occasion when the tables were turned and he found himself in the role of the accused man. My name is Áine Cain. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
We first connected while looking into the Burger Chef murders, an Indiana cold case. Together, we built a spreadsheet documenting hundreds of cases of restaurant-related homicides. That original spreadsheet gave way to our podcast, The Murder Sheet.
Now we maintain that same research-centric, investigative approach as we look into all sorts of homicides, including unsolved cases, historical crimes, and, of course, restaurant murders.
We don't just chat about the headlines. Our podcast is a platform for our journalism. The Murder Sheet focuses on investigative reporting, thoughtful analysis, thorough research, and in-depth interviews.
We're the Murder Sheet, and this is a conversation with Scott Turow. We're really excited that you're speaking with us. We both read the book,
Yeah.
Suspect, and
Loved
we really loved it. it was amazing how well you captured the voice of someone so different from yourself. And one thing we were wondering about, not only is she different in terms of generationally, but she's also different because she's a private eye instead of an attorney. So we were
Right.
curious, how did you capture that aspect of her character?
Well, candidly, that seemed a lot easier than, the 40-year age gap. But, I practiced criminal law for a long time and necessarily met a lot of investigators, many of whom would not say out loud some of the things that Pinky admits to. And it's a very funny life because you've got you've got these very big companies like Kroll, for example.
Kroll is a large firm that has conducted investigations in many prominent cases. For instance, back during the Larry Nassar case, Kroll was retained by Michigan State University to investigate sexual assault cases.
They're pretty much by the book, and then the other folks sort of live by doing what Kroll won't, and basically, trying to know where the lines are, but creeping right up to them and raising a little chalk dust. So, it wasn't hard to figure out what somebody like Pinky would be doing and thinking. And besides, she's Pinky. So, whatever the norms are, they're not going to restrict her. Again, I always bear in mind I was on a panel once with the late Robert Parker of Spencer fame, and somebody asked Bob about his research, and he answered, "Oh, I'm just a good typist." So, and I always took from that at the end of the day, whether there's not a private investigator in the country who would say, "Oh, I'm not like Pinky at all," that's beside the point. The question is, will the reader believe it? And, is it accurate in that way?
I myself am a millennial woman, and I thought you did a fantastic job capturing Pinky, and I loved her earnestness. That's sort of like the core of the character, and how dogged she is. And I'm just curious, I'm sure you've been asked about that a lot, but like, what was the process of sort of like, okay, I'm going to go for this writing about someone, in a totally different generation and capturing that authentic voice?
That was hard, obviously, and mostly because of my anxiety about it. It's not like I haven't had my ears open. And I have a daughter and a stepdaughter who are closer to Pinky's age. One of them is a little closer to Pinky's social experience. And, one of them identifies as queer. She was very helpful, obviously. And, there were a number of readers who said, no, this is just wrong. But, I was pretty proud of myself because of how relatively little of that there was. And, mostly I listened, and I think that process of listening began a long time before, because I think every generation tries to size up the generations either ahead or behind them and figure out, what's cooking for those people. So it was definitely, I never thought as I approached this book that I would have the temerity to try to write in the first person. And when I began writing, there was this voice, and I was like, no, you be quiet. Let me find the third person voice. And, but she kept talking to me. So I finally wrote my editor, Ben Severe, and, Ben knew what I was up to, but certainly not that I was going to write in the first person. And I sent him drafts, 2 drafts of the first chapter, one in the first person, one in the third. And and I was ready for him to say, no, you can't do this first person thing. He wrote back and said, you're right. It's much more lively. It's much more interesting than the third person. And, he was impressed by how much of my own voice I had sacrificed to get to Pinky's. Because Pinky is not a lettered person. She doesn't like to read. She's smart, obviously. But she is herself and never could submit to the discipline of school very well. So, and Ben just said, go for it. If it doesn't work, it won't take that long to rewrite it in the third person. So that's what we agreed to. But it did. It seems to have worked out. I think there have been a couple of snotty reviews which basically stop at saying, how dare he, but not with any specific complaints, just it's the chutzpah that bothers. It seemed to bother the reviewers. But generally speaking, this has been shockingly well accepted.
Yeah, it's a great book. We both really enjoyed it a great deal. And, I've read all of your novels, and I've enjoyed them all. You talk about, Bob Parker saying he's more of a typist than a researcher. But I guess, in a way, your day job, for lack of a better word, is your research for your novels.
Yeah.
I don't want to give away too much about the plot, but it involves some police misconduct, and that's certainly an area you've worked in.
That I knew really, really well. Beginning with my days as an assistant U.S. attorney, when I did a couple of police department investigations related to civil rights investigations. That is, in that term, that does not have to do with race. It had to do with police beating cases where cops, rather than arresting or in addition to arresting, decided to impose pretty severe corporal punishment of their own. And that was the first time I was exposed to police departments and, figuring out how hard it was to crack the blue code. And then I tried one of those cases and watched one of my police witnesses flip me on the stand, and, you have to eat his grand jury testimony word by word. But because I had that experience when I left for private practice, I was hired as a special prosecutor / investigator for a police department in Oak Park, Illinois. And Oak Park, which, has just a higher turmoil threshold than most towns could stand, at that point had a lot of conflict on its police department because one of the African-American officers had done a brave thing and said, some of my colleagues are keeping what's alleged to be stolen property. And so that turned into a wide-ranging investigation, including conduct that was very much like the Ritz's, going into making a dope bust and, keeping most of the money that was found in the apartment. Because what is the defendant going to say? I had more money or I had more drugs, neither one of which is going to do anything but, get him or her into deeper trouble. So, and then because I'd had those experiences, I was ultimately appointed to the state police merit board and was involved in the hiring and firing and disciplining of police officers. And everything before that led to certain officers coming to me and saying, I'd like you to represent me, because that is one thing about cops. They, when they're in trouble, they don't care if you're white, blue, or purple. They want a good lawyer because they figure it's a game and they want the best player on their side. And, I represented police officers in all kinds of contexts. Ultimately ended up representing the Labor Council of the state FOP. In other words, each of the Fraternal Order of Police lodges is separate bargaining unit, but the Labor Council obviously creates policy for them at a state council. So, and I still have good friends who are police officers, and I think I understand a lot about their world. That was not a lot of research for me. Understanding how a police disciplinary proceeding works. I've done that. I've been on both sides of that. I've been the prosecutor, and I've been the defense lawyer, and I've been the judge. So that was not difficult for me. The surveillance stuff, on the other hand, it was all discovery as far as I was concerned.
I'm curious, regarding the police, I was very interested in the sort of idea of police, maybe like small c corruption of like tightening a case on the scene by lying. And I love that. It lended a lot of realism, because it's not like this grand scheme to lie, but it's just kind of here and there sort of small lies, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, every cop will tell you, if you really get her or him, lubricated with a couple of drinks, that, because of the iron-headed nature of the legal system, every now and then you got to tighten up on a case. And I remember years ago, I represented a young man named Alex Hernandez, and Alex was accused of a horrible rape murder that he had nothing to do with, and he was first sentenced to death and then imprisoned for 12 years and finally exonerated. And in the course of doing that, an officer came to me who'd had some role in the investigation. And what he said when he walked through the door, the first time he provided information to us, was, look, lying to get somebody on a petty burglary rap, I won't pretend I've never done that when I know he's a bad guy. He said, but you don't lie to put somebody down on a murder conviction. And he felt that that's what had happened in this case. He provided useful information. He also provided a lot of bullshit leads, just because of the way cops are and the way they gossip about each other and the suspicions they hold of the people who aren't their friends. So it was pretty interesting. But I really do believe that ethic exists on almost all police forces, which is, you don't lie to put somebody in prison for a substantial period of time, or God forbid, to take their lives. So, and ultimately that's where that case started to unravel, when an officer essentially admitted having committed perjury.
The Alex Hernandez case is a fascinating example of a wrongful conviction. If you really want to get into all the details of it, we highly recommend the book Victims of Justice by Thomas Frisbee and Randy Garrett. It covers the entire story. But here are the basic facts. Janine Nicarico, a 10-year-old girl, was abducted from her home in 1983. She was raped and murdered. In 1985, Rolando Cruz and Alex Hernandez were tried together and were convicted of the crime and sentenced to death.
Later that year, a rapist and murderer named Brian Dugan confessed to killing Janine. In 1988, the Illinois Supreme Court reversed the convictions of Cruz and Hernandez. Both men were retried. Hernandez's second trial ended in a hung jury. He was tried again and convicted. This time, he was sentenced to 80 years. That was when Scott Turow got involved.
Well, I was brought into the case, which I had heard about while I was a prosecutor. And my friend, Jeremy Margolis, was the former, Jeremy had been my colleague and, really the guy who brought me into the U.S. Attorney's Office first. Jeremy left before I did and eventually became chief of the state police. And the state police had investigated Alex's case and determined that he and his co-defendant, Rolando Cruz, were almost certainly innocent because there was a third man named Brian Dugan who had committed this horrific crime. And there was pretty good reason to believe Dugan about that, since he had done the same thing to another little girl within about 20 miles of the first murder. And when he was caught, it's like, to make a grisly comparison, it's like Amnesty Day at the library, bringing in all your books. And Dugan, of course, was told, make a full breast of your crimes, and we'll see what we can work out. And he, of course, confessed to that murder of poor little Janine Carrico. And and Jeremy, and particularly a guy named Ed Sazowski who worked for him, were convinced about the innocence of Cruz and Hernandez, my client, and said, come into this case. At that point, Alex was on appeal from his second conviction. And I looked at him and I said, look, Jeremy, and I was working with the three wonderful defense lawyers who had represented Alex at trial. Mike Metnick and Jeff Erdangan and Jane Rayleigh. And, I looked at him, I said, look, I was a prosecutor a long time. I've worked in the criminal justice system. I'll believe you can convict an innocent man once, but how in God's name do you convict him twice if he's innocent? And of course, I learned a whole lot about capital cases and what happens in the case of grisly crimes and what happens in the case of an unscrupulous group of prosecutors. And I started reading the trial transcripts, and about halfway through I called Jeremy and I said, oh, well, now I understand how you convict an innocent man twice. You just lie about everything. And that was really what had happened. There were grotesque behavior by the prosecutors, three of whom ended up being charged with crimes themselves. They were acquitted, which, a lot about police investigations is not surprising, since juries have a very, very hard time convicting anybody in law enforcement for being overzealous in doing their jobs. But as far as I was concerned, and as far as I am concerned today, none of those men were unfairly accused of crimes, and certainly was probable cause to believe that. And, and they had taken 12 years of Alex and Rolando's lives. Both ultimately were the beneficiaries of large civil settlements, as they well should have been. But it was just, I really, really, really did not believe before I started in that case that there were people so venal and so driven by the realities of elective politics that they would lie, make up evidence in order to convict two men. And that's what happened.
And we understand that you've done a lot of research and sort of like looking into the subject of capital punishment, for the state of Illinois, and, diving into that. And also with your experience with the Hernandez case, how has that sort of informed your opinions on that subject?
This is going to sound a little funny, but I thought the behavior in Alex's case was so extreme that he taught almost no lessons about the system, which is to say that if you have people who are willing to act like criminals in the law enforcement system, then, bad things are going to happen. But I thought then, and I still believe, yes, there are a lot of overzealous prosecutors. Ask Adnan Syed about that. Um, uh, and they develop a sort of lead shield around their consciences at times. But to outright make up evidence, I didn't think that happened. So I didn't think there was a great lesson about the criminal justice system or the capital system, because I assumed those episodes would be relatively rare. I will tell you that in the eyes of most Americans, if you say that, every 10 years there's a prosecutor somewhere in the United States who's willing to lie and cheat in order to convict somebody of a capital crime, for them that's enough to get rid of the death penalty. But it wasn't until I was appointed as a member of the Capital Punishment Commission by Governor Ryan, because I represented Alex and had some other death row clients, that I really tried to look at the system objectively. And even when I started there, I was what I called the death penalty agnostic. I had not made up my mind irretrievably about capital punishment. With the opportunity to spend 2 years studying the system, I'm pretty sure I read every first-degree murder case decided by an appellate court in the state of Illinois or the Supreme Court. Certain things became obvious to me. And the most important was that the capital system didn't work. And it doesn't work by its own terms. In other words, people want capital punishment because they think it will provide moral clarity, namely for some crimes that are so horrible and unspeakable. For ultimate evil, there ought to be ultimate punishment. And it doesn't happen. People who get convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death are very frequently not the worst of the worst. And on the other hand, the worst of the worst are often because of systemic needs, like, let's save time and not spend 3 months on trial. They're allowed to live, so that, in the same counties where Alex was convicted, there were crimes equally horrific where people have been allowed to plead out for life sentences. And, what sense does that make? And then you add on top of it the race effect, which is the race of the victim, much more likely to get the death penalty in the U.S. for killing a white person than killing a black person. And that's without regard to the race of the murderer. Gender, women just don't get sentenced to death as often as men. And sometimes they've committed some pretty grisly crimes, like, a lady in Lake County who, poured lye down the throat of her infant daughter. You're better off committing murder in a poor county than in a rich county, because a poor county can't dedicate the resources to a capital prosecution. And rich counties can more easily afford that. There were so many random factors, including just the convictions of the prosecutor, that influenced who was sentenced to death and who wasn't. It's just like, this system doesn't deliver a clear message. It's a hodgepodge. And, people who haven't committed crimes anywhere near as grave as other people get sentenced to death. And it makes absolutely no sense. And the arguments in favor of it, like deterrence, that's the favorite. That doesn't hold up under scrutiny either. And that's because when you take the young, poor men who are overwhelmingly, who gets convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, without engaging in too gross a generalization, I think, in most cases, they come from backgrounds so deprived that if you say to them, what'll happen tomorrow? They look at you and go, I don't know, man, what's going to happen tomorrow? They are without a sense of the future because their own lives have been so fractured and unpredictable. So you're not going to deter them because in order to have a sense of consequences, you have to believe in the future.
You mentioned the Hernandez case didn't reveal any really systemic problems with the system. With the Chris Thomas case, I believe you rather memorably said that he may have been on death row for the crime of having bad attorneys.
Yeah.
Is that something that happens a lot?
Yeah. I wouldn't say, by the way, that I was talking about my naive perspective on Hernandez.
Right.
And certainly what I learned revealed a moral depravity that I still hope is not widespread in the criminal justice system. Chris's case is more typical of what I was talking about with the criminal justice system.
Let's take a moment to quickly summarize the story of Chris Thomas. We hear a great deal about people sentenced to death who may actually be innocent of the crime of which they were convicted. But that is not the case here. Chris Thomas was guilty. His story raises a different issue. How do we decide which guilty people deserve to be put to death? Here's the story.
Thomas and a couple of friends ran out of gas in a mall parking lot. On the spur of the moment, they decided to rob someone. They spotted a delivery driver named Rafael Gasconia and confronted him. Thomas put a gun to the man's head. During the ensuing struggle, Thomas shot his weapon, killing Gasconia. Taking a life under almost all circumstances is a horrible crime deserving serious punishment. Generally, however, people are not sentenced to death unless the details of the murder are more egregious than what happened with Chris Thomas. So, what happened?
Chris was represented by two men who'd signed a contract with the county for the sum of $30,000. They had to handle 103 cases, and 6 of them had to be first-degree murders. And when you do the arithmetic, you know, that's a little less than $300 a case. And, you know, for $300, you get what you paid for in terms of representation. And neither of these men who originally represented Alex were bad people. They were trying to make a living. They were former prosecutors who just took it for granted that everybody who's accused of that kind of crime is guilty. And there was no question, frankly, at the end of the day, that Chris was guilty. But that was not the full analysis. The question is whether he deserved to be sentenced to death. And it really appeared to me that he had shot the poor, hardworking, wonderful young man, Mr. Gasconia. He had shot him impulsively and killed him. And you walk around with a loaded gun and you try to stick somebody up and you end up killing them. The law treats that as a murder, and I'm not here to question that. But how do you end up going from a crime that was obviously not long contemplated in advance to the death penalty? Well, you've got to, first of all, have lawyers who don't do any investigation into Chris's background. And there were horrible facts in Chris's life. He'd been raised in a crack house, and his aunt used to travel out to Waukegan from Chicago by train every Sunday, take him to dinner, give him a little money. He'd go back to the crack house and they'd strip him naked to find the money that his aunt had given him. And that kind of experience, especially when it's your mom who's letting that happen, that does not lead to building great trust in other human beings. And so you had, and that part of Chris's background had gone entirely uninvestigated. And, but instead, the lawyers let Chris get up at his sentencing and deny that he committed the crime, which so infuriated the judge, who never sentenced anybody else to death his entire career, that he sentenced Chris to death. And, you can look back at that transcript and see a young man who is saying, as I interpret it, I don't trust these lawyers. You gave me bad lawyers and I don't trust them. And, but the judge didn't hear that. He heard somebody say, I didn't do it, when he damn well had. So he thought he, was amoral and sentenced him to death.
I'm curious too. We have some questions about how your work as a lawyer has informed your novels. But I'm curious, would you say that working as a novelist has impacted how you practice law?
Well, every criminal defense lawyer has to be part psychiatrist, because, people who commit crimes, and even people who didn't commit crimes but are accused of it, are all in a kind of psychiatric state. And of course, the wrongly accused, frankly, are in some ways worse off than the correctly accused. And so you've got to both have empathy, but like an author, you both have to see the world through their eyes and try to make, rational, not cold-hearted, but more distant judgments about what they're saying and what might have happened. And then you're really trying to imagine what is alleged and what actually occurred. And so the skills of a novelist are always very helpful, especially, in both in dealing with clients and in being able to come up with a coherent explanation for the crime. Even so, you still will miss the obvious. And, when Chris Thomas finally, after 4 years of representing him, explained what had occurred in that parking lot, all of the evidence made complete sense. But it was something, and I'll leave as in the realm of confidence, is exactly what Chris said. But, it made sense of all the forensic evidence, and it was something that I'd never imagined. And it was really very simple. So, Chris didn't know that evidence well enough to be making this up so that he could be explaining the stippling from the gun blast in the skin of poor Gascoigne. So reality, it constantly outstrips the imagination of the novelist.
I was curious, in Suspect, there's, I won't give away too many spoilers for our listeners, but there's a very intensive investigation that starts to sort of take place at some point. And you yourself, we understand, were part of one very sprawling, very intensive investigation into topics like, law enforcement, or rather, justice system corruption, Operation Graylord. And I was wondering, could you tell us about that and if that sort of influenced any aspects of Suspect?
Well, my experiences in the criminal justice system and my experiences as a prosecutor, they're always with me. They're part of who I am. And as I said, I was part of a number of police department investigations from all sides. So, I spent 8 years doing complex grand jury investigations, where you're really peeling the onion and forcing people to talk. Frankly, you don't get very far, by trying to, just persuade people to be good people and tell the truth. Generally speaking, you put them in a situation where they've got no choice but to tell the truth. And that gives you one little piece of the truth, and then you try to get the next. But at least you've got leverage then. Because Mr. A presumably tells you the truth, and you go to Ms. B and say, I know you did this, or I know you did this certain thing, or I know this part of your police report is a fabrication, and I'm going to give you a chance to clean this up now, once, very, very much like ultimately happens in one of those scenes in Suspect. I lived that life, and the life of a prosecutor is so emotionally intense that it's just burned into your brain. It really is, and it's still in my dreams.
You dream about cases that you had tried?
I don't dream about the cases, but this, per se, but, I am often the prosecutor or the defendant, or occasionally the defense lawyer in my dreams. And of course it's a dream. It's not all unfolding rationally. Somehow a parking ticket in your dreams becomes a capital offense because you're so embarrassed about it. But yeah, it's always there.
Does dealing about some of the cases and stuff you've worked on, does putting them in a fictional context help exercise some of that? Pleading, personal injuries kind of touched on some of the Graylord.
Yeah, Personal Injuries was definitely Graylord.
Personal Injuries is an acclaimed 1999 novel. In it, Turow tells the story of Robbie Favor, a lawyer who gets caught bribing judges to decide cases his way. The FBI agrees to go easy on him if he consents to work for them to help them get evidence against the judges. There is quite a bit more to it than that, but suffice to say, it is well worth seeking out and reading.
And, as Turow says, it is inspired by his real-life work on Operation Graylord, an undercover operation that resulted in the indictments of 17 judges, 48 lawyers, 8 court officials, and even 1 state legislator.
Of course, that sprawling investigation was actually made a little bit smaller. And, I'm not positive I dealt with anybody in Graylord who was quite as morally complex as Robbie Favor was. But you're still dealing with people who, often have done very decent things and, been good parents. Or I tried a guy named Dan McGovern for bribing hearing officers at the real estate assessment agency in Cook County. And McGovern was just one of the nicest, most decent people I'd ever met. And yet this was his second time through the mill. He'd gotten immunity once before. And, now he was essentially accused of the same thing, of a, bribery offense. And didn't get along particularly well with his own lawyer. So he sat with the prosecutors during the court breaks. And he never told me he didn't do it. But he was very accepting of his responsibility for what he had done. But he'd done it, he'd done it. That didn't, he's kind of an extreme case in the sense that, he'd had a terrific life of involvement with lots of charities. And, but, he accepted the rules of the game in Cook County. It meant paying off public officials in order to make a living. And that's unacceptable. And the man's got to go to prison, and he went. So, and there is lots of that. But as I said, I don't know if I met anybody quite as morally complex as Robbie Favre.
I'm curious, we've talked about sort of you being on both sides of the prosecution defense,
Yeah.
and then just all the shades of gray that really come through in your work. You have a lot of decent people who are trying their best, but, obviously complications often arise, and sort of low level corruption kind of is shot through the whole thing. But just from a perspective of, what do you think necessary reforms would look like for, policing, but also the justice system writ large? We've talked about some of the problems, and I guess any sort of high level thoughts on how do we fix this? How do we become a more fair and equitable system?
Yeah. I will admit that I never thought much of the mantra of defund the police. And I have too much respect for and understanding of the incredibly difficult role that cops have to talk about defunding the police. If I had to get one concept through the heads of police officers, it would probably be that it is not your responsibility to be judge and jury. And your job is to arrest the people you think have committed crimes. And I know that it involves often tremendous anxiety about your own personal safety, and often great courage to make these arrests. Anybody who works undercover and on drugs, for example, they go out there every day knowing they can get blown away. I understand that, but you have to do your job in good faith and let the system operate. In Chicago right now, the police are very unhappy about, the attitude in the state's attorney's office.
Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx has come under fire in some quarters for following policies that some critics perceive as being soft on crime, while others hail those same policies as helping to achieve a more just system. For instance, the Marshall Project did research showing that Foxx chose not to prosecute more than 5,000 low-level, nonviolent criminal cases that would have been prosecuted under the previous state's attorney.
It is easy to see how some would interpret that as letting criminals off the hook, but the Chicago Sun-Times saw things differently. The paper's editorial board noted that throwing the book at thousands of low-level, nonviolent offenders does nothing to make our streets safe or help those offenders turn their lives around. As Turow notes, many people in Chicago area law enforcement seem more inclined to side with those who take a negative view of Fox's policies.
What Kim Foxx decides to do really should not be bothering them. They should, but instead, in Chicago, they're reluctant to make arrests. Why? Because Kim Foxx is just going to let them go. Or they, I presume, are tightening up the cases in a way that, exceeds what was done in the past. But I approach policing with empathy because it's an incredibly difficult job without a pay scale that's commensurate with either the risks or the anguish of the job. In Chicago, the problem is not defunding police. It's that they can't even fill the available slots in the police department because people don't want to be police officers anymore because they're not respected on the street. And people assume they're racist just because they put on a badge. A city like Chicago, thanks to the idiots in the Supreme Court, is, a mob with guns. And it's an incredibly dangerous job as a result. So who the hell in their right mind would want that job? And people aren't taking it. And, where did that get us? Except an increase in crime, in the city. So, convincing police officers that they're not responsible for everything, that they should do their job in good faith, and accept the fact that they're an important but not the only component of the criminal justice system, is really important. And they don't like Kim Foxx. That's fine, but she got elected, and she didn't make any bones about what she was going to do. And they may think it's wrong, but they didn't get elected to make those decisions. She did.
Absolutely. I'm curious in terms of just as this is more of an author question, but why do you think people, Americans, I guess in general at this point, are so fascinated with stories about crime, whether they're true stories or fictional stories? What drives that?
I think everybody is tempted by criminality. Everybody imposes the will on themselves, not to break the law, whether it's not running red lights or handing back the change when you get too much at McDonald's. And it's a matter of degree, but, everybody is tempted to do wrong. And so that's why crime stories almost always end with the moral, like Aesop, that crime doesn't pay, that, you get punished if you commit a crime. That's to reinforce the morality that people impose on themselves. And so people are always fascinated with the riddle of how do other people get the wherewithal to break the law, and how do they get detected and punished after they've done it? And it's an eternal conflict of living in society. And when I realized this, about halfway through my career as a prosecutor, as I sat in a courtroom looking at the absolutely rapt attitudes of everybody listening to the testimony of a witness in what was supposedly a picayune and minor case involving stolen food stamps, it dawned on me that because of my concerns about the same issues, that the subject that had always eluded me in my earlier years as a writing fellow and a member of the English department at Stanford, that I'd finally found my subject, because this was A, what I wanted to write about, B, what I could write about, and C, something that was going to be of interest to a broad audience. And I always had that view that, art is not made great by being hard to understand. So to the extent that, a broad popular audience is drawn to something, that's a plus for its quality as a work of art.
I'm also curious, you have so many fascinating stories about your legal career. And of course, your first book was a memoir of your first year as a law student. Have you ever considered writing some sort of a memoir about your legal career?
The short answer is yes, but, the ban of grand jury secrecy is permanent. And there is no Rule 6E of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure has no time limit in it. So I'm sure if I thought about this, I could do it. And, I'm old enough now to think about doing something on the order of memoir. And I may. I'm certainly committed to writing another novel now, and I'll see how I feel when I finish it. But it's a good suggestion, and it's one that I have to think about more actively.
Can you? You say you're working on another novel now. Can you give us any hints?
That's what I was going to ask.
I'm going back to Rusty Savage one more time, and he's in an entirely different life now, in a different place, and he's going to find himself in a role that he's never occupied before, which is the defense lawyer for the accused. So he's been the accused, he's been the judge, he's been the prosecutor. Now he's going to occupy that other role.
That's very tantalizing.
He's been through it.
He knows it from all sides.
Sort of like you, except you've never been accused. So.
Well, that actually is, not completely true. I had horrible experience when I left the Justice Department, and I was under investigation for a while, and I sure didn't do what they thought I had done. But
can you tell us about that?
Yeah, when I was in AUSA, in order to develop evidence for Graylord, frankly, I was asked to preside over an incredibly corrupt, lawless guy who wanted to plead guilty and inform the government. Of course, he wanted to do it, and as it turned out, in a according to his own lights, and pick and choose who we would talk about, and that would never work, and we ultimately broke off our communications with him. But in the course of doing that, he told me about a client who had asked him to engage with the client in a major drug offense. And at that point in time, we wanted to keep the guy's role under wraps. So we couldn't just call the U.S. Attorney's Office in Florida and say, here's your guy, because we didn't want to burn the informant. He had given us information that ultimately proved to be true about a couple of judges who were taking money in the criminal courts in Cook County. He ultimately proved an utterly useless witness against those people. But so what the U.S. attorney decided was that we would have to pursue this drug investigation in Florida ourselves. And because the attorney-client relationship was being used not as an attorney-client relationship, but as a criminal relationship, that, we were free to have the attorney tape record his client. Now, this was a pretty daring position, and it was approved in the upper reaches of the Justice Department. But when the shit hit the fan, all the people I had been following scattered, and I was left holding the bag. And for some reason, I was thinking about this morning, and I take it for granted that you can't always expect the best of people. And when it happened, I was the author of Presumed Innocent, and that's why I drew on the lightning. And it didn't surprise me that the other, the more intensive the scrutiny of me and the more harsh the criticism, the less people wanted to step forward and say, I told him to do it. And oddly, my wife blames those people more than I do for, their lack of courage. Ultimately, one of my friends, Jim Ferguson, who remained in the U.S. Attorney's Office, doggedly pursued the files. And of course, the funniest part about this was that the people in the Justice Department who'd signed off on this, they didn't even want to give up the documents. So it took Jim forever. But he finally found, a copy of the order where somebody in the Justice Department had approved all of this and signed off on it. And that, of course, became the end of the case. But it took a year and a half. So, yeah, I've been through that. I ended up paying my own legal fees, which I could afford, fortunately for me, and which most prosecutors or public defenders can't. And so I formed this unlikely alliance with the late Orrin Hatch and tried to get legislation through Congress, which ultimately passed. And, that would compensate prosecutors and FBI agents and federal defenders who were subjected to allegations of criminal behavior for which the Justice Department couldn't defend them because they're both the prosecutor and they can't be the defense lawyer too. And after all the work to get it through Congress, George Bush the first vetoed it because it was part of the crime bill, and he didn't like the way the Democrats had softened that bill. So, and we were never able to revive that provision. So it's still the case that if you're an AUSA or a federal defender or an FBI agent, like, the people who we've been hearing a lot about in the news, like Peter Strzok, you're stuck paying your own fees. And that's why so many books are written in the aftermath, or you see these people as TV commentators because they're paying off their legal bills.
Jesus. That's like a whole separate rabbit hole.
It's a whole separate rabbit hole. But it made me a much better lawyer for my clients because I understood what it felt like. Especially, and most of the people I've represented in grand jury investigations did not do what the government thought they did. And I could look them in the eye and say, I know, I've been there, and it came to the right end for me. And, I'm very hopeful it'll come to the right end for you.
Well, we've taken up the full hour. Is there this has been delightful and we really
Thank you so
appreciate
much.
it. Is there anything we didn't ask you about that you wanted to mention?
No, I mean, that's, I'm sure we could go on for another hour and I'd enjoy talking about myself, but and particularly to, two people who've done all the homework you have. So, but I'll just say thank you. I'm always grateful when I'm talking to people who've done the amount of work the two of you have.
We love your work. So,
Yeah.
So,
Well,
anyway.
thank you so much for your time, sir. We really do
Sure.
appreciate it.
My pleasure, and I'll, be happy to come back whenever. So,
yeah,
thank you.
We'll take you up
we
on
will
that.
take you up on that.
We want to thank Scott Turow for taking the time to talk with us today. You can find his novel, Suspect, for sale wherever you buy books. We both really enjoyed it. And if you're interested in the justice system and the men and women who are a part of that justice system and how they make decisions and live their lives, we think you'd really enjoy it too. And frankly, you'd enjoy any of his books. He's a terrific writer. Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening.